It was February 24th, 1978. A cold Friday night in Northern California. The kind of night when the Sierra Nevada mountains turned ominous. Their forested roads coated in silence and iced 5 young men, friends, teammates, and dreamers, piled into a turquoise and white Mercury Montego after watching their local basketball team play in Chico. For most people, it was just another small-town game. But for these men, the night carried excitement. In only a day's time, they were scheduled to play in their own Special Olympics basketball tournament. The 5 friends were Gary Mathias, Ted Wyha, Jack Madruga, Jack Hoot, and Bill Sterling. They weren't ordinary in the sense most people imagined. Each of them lived with some form of intellectual disability or mental health challenge. Yet together, they found comfort and strength. They weren't outcasts when they were with one another. They were a team bound by trust, routine, and loyalty. That Friday evening, they drove north from their homes in Yuba City and Marysville to Chico, about 50 miles away. They cheered, they laughed, and they celebrated as their team, UC Davis, won the game. Afterwards, they stopped at a convenience store for snacks and drinks. By all accounts, their spirits were high, and their destination was clear. Home, but they never made it back. The vanishing drive at some point after leaving Chico. Instead of turning south toward Yuba City, their car headed northeast. The desolate wilderness of Plumas National Forest. It made no sense. None of their families could explain why. All 5 knew they had a basketball game of their own the very next morning. They had laid out their uniforms. They had told family members about the tournament with childlike excitement. Some even prepared their belongings in advance. Missing it wasn't an option. And yet, hours later, long after the game in Chico ended, their car would be discovered in a place that baffled investigators and horrified loved ones. The abandoned Coron, a lonely mountain road, deep in the forest. The Montego was found abandoned. Its doors were unlocked. One window rolled down, keys gone. No sign of the 5 young men. The road was rough, narrow, and treacherous, a path that made no sense for a car like theirs. The Montego wasn't 4-wheel drive, yet the underside bore no signs of damage. Whoever had driven it had navigated the terrain carefully. But why were they there at all? Police, rescuers, and families all asked the same question. The car was discovered 70 miles away from Chico, in the opposite direction of home. A detour none of them had reason to take. Even stranger, the car still had fuel. It wasn't stuck in mud or snow. It could have been pushed free with ease. Yet it was simply left behind, as if abandoned in a hurry. The night was bitterly cold. Snow covered the forest. Survival without shelter or proper clothing was almost impossible. And these 5, wearing only light jackets, sneakers, and shirts, were entirely unprepared for mountain conditions. The panic of the families when Saturday morning came. Their families expected to see them at the tournament, but the gym remained empty. Their chairs, lined neatly with uniforms, went unused. Phone calls went unanswered. No one had seen them. Soon, panic spread across Yuba County. These weren't young men who wandered off often. They had their routines. They had their families. And they had been looking forward to the game for weeks. For them to vanish overnight was terrifying. By Sunday, authorities were involved. Search parties combed the forests, following icy trails and scanning rugged terrain. Helicopters soared above the Sierra Nevada, while ground crews struggled against snowdrifts and freezing winds. But no trace emerged. Not a footprint, not a single clue beyond a silent, abandoned car. Theories take hold from the very beginning. The disappearance defied logic. Some speculated the group had gotten lost. But why take the mountain road in the first place? Others wondered if foul play was involved. Perhaps someone lured them there. Yet there was no sign of a struggle. And then came the most chilling theory of all, that they had been running from something. The men were familiar with the area. Jack Madruga, for example, had driven that car countless times. He was protective of it. Friends said he never would have allowed it to be abandoned. Something had forced them away. Witness sightings in the days after the disappearance. Witnesses came forward with strange accounts. One man reported seeing 5 figures near a mountain store on that same Friday night. Another claimed he saw what looked like their car parked along the forest road, but nothing could be confirmed. Each account blurred into uncertainty. For the families, the agony deepened. Mothers and fathers clung to the hope that their sons were alive, perhaps lost, perhaps cold, but waiting for rescue. The search stretched on. Days turned into weeks. Helicopters swept wider and wider areas. Dogs were brought in. Every ravine, every back road, every snow-covered clearing was checked, and still, nothing. The suffocating silence by the 3rd week. Frustration and fear consumed the families. How could 5 men, a full-sized car, and all evidence simply vanish in a modern world? The Sierra Nevada was vast, yes, but surely something would have turned up: a trail, a jacket, a shoe dot. But all the forest returned was silence. As spring neared, snow swallowed any hope of easy discovery. If the men were out there, they were buried under white drifts, hidden from the world. Search efforts slowed. The case began to shift from rescue to recovery, but the families refused to accept that their sons were gone. They had to believe that somehow the men would come walking back down from the mountain. They prayed for survival. They prayed for answers instead. They were left with a mystery so deep that even investigators whispered about its strangeness. That vanishing without reason, the first chapter of this haunting story closes not with answers, but with question why. Did the 5 young men, on the night before their most anticipated tournament, drive 70 miles into the mountains? Why did they abandon a car that worked perfectly fine? And why, despite weeks of searching, was there no sign of them anywhere? The mountain had swallowed them whole. And for now, the forest kept its secret, but the silence wouldn't last forever. Because 17 weeks later, when the snow melted, the Sierra Nevada would finally reveal the horrifying truth about the Yuba County Five. The search for the 5 friends had escalated from concern to panic by the time the sun rose on that cold February morning. Their families knew something was terribly wrong. These weren't reckless kids, prone to disappearing. They were responsible. Young men, each with their routines, their jobs, their families waiting at home. But now, 5 seats sat empty at 5 different breakfast tables. And in a town where everybody knew everybody, their sudden absence wasn't just unusual, it was impossible to ignore. The last sighting the night before. Witnesses remembered seeing the group piling into a turquoise Mercury Montego after the basketball game. The vehicle, old but sturdy, was the kind of car you could spot a mile away. One woman later recalled seeing it parked outside a convenience store just after 10 p.m. Inside, she noticed the 5 young men laughing, grabbing snacks, and talking animatedly about the game they had just watched. And then, nothing. That was the last confirmed sighting. By morning, the car was gone. The young men were gone. and the questions began to mount. The families sounded the alarm. The parents called each other frantically. Had their sons decided to spend the night somewhere together? Had there been an accident? By 9 a.m., when not one of the young men showed up for work or called home, the families alerted police. This wasn't just unusual behavior, this was completely out of character. The police began the search, starting with the obvious, retracing their steps from the basketball game to their homes. They canvassed the gas stations and diners along the route. Locals were questioned, flyers were printed, but in those early days, what haunted everyone was the silence. No phone calls, no trace. It was as though the five had been swallowed whole by the night. The car hunt authorities knew that if they could find the Montego, they'd find the boys. That car was the key. For days, search parties combed the highways, dirt roads, and wooded trails in the region. Helicopters buzzed overhead, scanning frozen rivers and narrow ravines. Volunteers trudged through the snow, calling out names, hoping for a response that never came. And still, nothing. The car might as well have driven off the face of the earth. It was then that whispers began spreading through the small town. People wondered aloud, had the boys been targeted? Had they stumbled into something darker than anyone realized? Some spoke of gangs, others of reclusive mountain men in the wilderness nearby, and a few, more superstitious, muttered about the forest itself, how sometimes it kept those who entered. Strange leads days turned into weeks, and the case only grew more confusing. One tip came from a man living near the foothills. He claimed he had seen a group of young men matching their description walking along a remote dirt road late that night. Another reported hearing car doors slamming near his farm. Though when he investigated, there was no one there, but each lead ended in a dead end. And then came the most chilling tip of all. A man, visibly shaken, approached investigators. He swore he had seen the turquoise Montego deep in the mountains, place few would dare to go in the dead of winter. He had been driving back from a hunting trip when he caught a glimpse of the car, stuck in the snow, lights off, motionless. But when he led police back to the location, the car was gone. No tracks, no evidence. As if the earth had swallowed it. Was he mistaken, hallucinating? Or had someone been there, only to move the car before authorities could arrive? Mounting pressure, the community's anxiety was at a breaking point. The local news picked up the story, followed quickly by national outlets. Cameras swarmed the town. Reporters knocked on doors, desperate for details. The missing friends became headlines. 5 vanish after basketball game. Car and victims still missing. Their smiling faces stared back from newspapers and television screens, immortalized in yearbook photos and family albums. But behind the media frenzy, the families endured a torment no headline could capture. Every night they left the porch, light on, praying the car would pull into the driveway. Every phone ring sent their hearts racing. The waiting was unbearable. A darker theory emerges as weeks stretched into months. Investigators began exploring darker possibilities. Could the 5 have been lured into something? A trap? Some speculated they had witnessed something they shouldn't have, a crime, perhaps, or a secret meeting in the woods. Others suggested abduction, a chilling thought that gnawed at the family's minds. But if it was abduction, why take 5 men at once? Why leave no ransom note, no demand, no trace? It didn't make sense. The families clung to hope, but law enforcement knew the longer the boys remained missing, the less likely they would return alive. Seasons change, winter melted into spring, and still nothing. The rivers thawed, the forests bloomed, and the small town returned to its rhythms. But for the families, life had stopped on that February night. Every day without answers was another knife in the wound. Then, just as hope began to fade, a discovery was made. It was not the discovery anyone had prayed for. The uneasy discovery, 17 weeks after the disappearance, hikers stumbled upon something chilling in the mountains, nearly 70 miles away from where the boys had last been. Seen, it was a car, a turquoise Mercury Montego, the missing car. Its tires were caked in mud, its windows streaked with frost. It sat eerily out of place, surrounded by tall pines, half buried in snow. Inside, the seats were empty. No sign of the boys, but there was something even stranger. The car's fuel tank was half full. The keys were still in the ignition, and the vehicle itself was in working condition. It hadn't broken down. It hadn't run out of gas. The boys had simply walked away. But why, and where had they gone? The mountain held its secrets tightly. But soon, it would give up something far more, haunting something no one could forget. The turquoise Mercury Montego had been found, but the 5 friends were still missing. To investigators, it was both a breakthrough and a puzzle. The car was intact. No signs of struggle, no broken glass, no blood. The ignition key was right, there, waiting to be turned. And yet, its owners had walked away from it, into the most unforgiving wilderness in the dead of winter. Why? This was not a place you abandoned shelter. This was a place that killed the unprepared. And as the investigation unfolded, it became clear. The mountain wasn't done with its secrets. Inside, the car forensic teams combed through the Montego. They found candy wrappers, a basketball program from the game, and neatly folded maps. The glove box held receipts, proving the boys had stopped for gas that very night. But what they didn't find was just as important. No coats, no survival gear, no sign of panic. It was as though the 5 had simply parked the car, stepped out into the snow, and vanished into the trees. The families were shattered. This discovery ruled out one theory: a staged disappearance or a runaway. These young men hadn't planned to vanish. Something had forced them out of that car. But what the search expands now that the car was located. Search teams pushed deeper into the Sierra Nevada. Helicopters scanned ridges. Dogs sniffed along ravines. Dozens of volunteers scoured the woods. Still, days turned into weeks with no sign. And then, the thaw began. As spring crept across the mountain, melting snow exposed what winter had hidden. And with it came the first answer, an answer too horrifying for words. The first body hikers discovered a body just a short distance from the Montego. It was lying face up in the snow, partially mummified by the cold. The clothing matched one of the missing boys, but the condition of the body raised more questions than answers. There were no major injuries, no clear cause of death, just a man frozen in time as though sleep had overtaken him in the snow. The community braced for the worst because they knew if one had been found, the others could not be far behind. The cabin in the woods. A few weeks later, a Forest Service worker stumbled on something almost cinematic in its horror. 70 miles from where the boys had last been seen stood a small, abandoned ranger cabin. The door hung ajar. The windows were frosted over. Inside, what he found would haunt him forever. On the floor, wrapped in blankets, lay the emaciated body of another boy. But this time, the scene told a far stranger story. The cabin had food, enough. Canned rations to last all 5 men for months. Inside was fuel for heating, stacks of wood, and basic supplies. Yet almost none of it had been touched. The stove sat unused. The food cans were unopened. It was as though the boys had walked into a lifeline and then ignored it until death claimed them. A disturbing clue: autopsies revealed that the young man found in the cabin had survived for weeks, possibly as long as 3 months after the disappearance. His beard had grown out. His weight had withered away from starvation. He had slowly wasted to death in a cabin stocked with food. But why hadn't he eaten? Some theorized he had been waiting, hoping the others would return. Maybe he didn't know how to use the supplies. Maybe fear clouded his judgment. But the most disturbing theory was that he hadn't been alone when he first arrived. More bodies appeared in the weeks that followed. 2 more bodies were discovered along a mountain trail leading from the car to the cabin. Their positions suggested they had been walking desperately toward safety. One lay curled under a tree, as though he had collapsed mid-step. Another was sprawled across the path, his hands raw from clawing at the snow. Both appeared to have succumbed to exhaustion and exposure. That left just one boy still missing. His body was never found. To this day, the wilderness keeps him. Theories take shape now. The question was not where the boys had gone, but why. Why abandon a working car? Why march 70 miles into the mountains in snow and darkness? Why ignore food and supplies in a cabin that could have saved them? Theories began to spread like wildfire. Some said the group had been chased by strangers, by criminals, by someone who forced them off the road and into the wilderness. Others believed it was a tragic case of disorientation, a wrong turn made worse by fear. But one chilling detail stood out. The cabin's window had been smashed from the inside. Whoever was there had broken it, not to get in, but to get out. Why? The survivors who never returned. Experts pieced together the puzzle as best they could. The group may have tried to take shelter in the cabin, but confusion and paranoia consumed them. Perhaps 1 or 2 went for help and never came back. The one who remained wasted away, waiting. But even this explanation didn't satisfy everyone. Too many details didn't add up. Why didn't they eat? Why didn't they light the stove? Why didn't they stay together? Theories turned darker. Some whispered of foul play, that someone had led them there. Others suggested a psychological break, that one among them had panicked and convinced the others to flee rational thought. And then there were the more sinister ideas, that they had stumbled upon something they weren't meant to see in those mountains, something that silenced them forever. Families' grief, for the families' theories meant little. What they had were graves to bury and empty chairs that could never be filled. One mother said, "Every night I still listen for his car in the driveway. Even now, I can't stop." A father broke down on live television, unable to finish his words. The grief was raw, permanent, and unrelenting. The mountain had taken their sons and only given back pieces of them, a case that haunts decades later. The story of the 5 missing friends remains one of the most chilling, unsolved mysteries in America. Their case has been studied by criminologists, survival experts, and even psychologists trying to understand how a group could perish in such baffling circumstances. The truth remains elusive. Were they lost, misled, or driven by something darker? Something that still lurks in the woods of the Sierra Nevada. All anyone knows for certain is this. On that cold February night, 5 young men drove into the darkness. Only the mountain knows why they never came back. Closing reflection in the end, the story is not just about mystery. It's about fragility, how quickly routine can shatter, how 5 ordinary lives can slip into legend, swallowed by snow and silence, and how sometimes the scariest mysteries aren't found in ghost stories or folklore. They're found in the choices real people make, in real moments, with consequences that echo across decades. The mountain stands silent today. The cabin still exists, weather-beaten and forgotten, tucked into the trees like a tomb. And somewhere in that wilderness, maybe even now, lies the missing boy who never came home. His story, their story, is a reminder. The world can take everything from us in a single night, and sometimes the answers never come.